When we think of regulation of prostitution today, around us in the United States, what do we imagine? Perhaps we imagine police officers arresting scantily clad women on street corners, or a ring of high-end escorts being busted by some sort of task force. Whatever we may believe to be the process, prostitution in the United States today is a crime, something to be stamped out altogether. Interestingly, though, in history, this has not always been the case. During the Second Empire in France, in a time when the show of extravagance put on by the upper classes masked extreme poverty and degradation, prostitution was seen as an inevitable facet of society. And since it was believed ending prostitution was not an option, the authorities decided to come up with an elaborate system of regulation, one which was envied elsewhere in Europe. Just as today, there are different classes of prostitutes, a similar hierarchy existed during the Second Empire, and the more upper-class kept women of the demi-monde were generally safe from the perils which faced the streetwalkers of Paris. Along with this system of regulation, and contributing largely to the need for it, was a widespread fear of syphilis in France, but especially Paris, during the Second Empire. With as much as 20% of Paris's population affected by syphilis by the end of the 19th century, society went looking for a scapegoat, and because it was understood that the disease was transmitted sexually, the blame came to rest squarely on the shoulders of womankind, in particular the Parisian prostitutes. When the system of regulation is viewed through this lens, then, it becomes more clear that each particular measure was instituted with the goal of stopping syphilis in its tracks. The first major tenet of this system of regulation was the registration of prostitutes, which could be voluntary or more often took place involuntarily after an arrest. In order to voluntarily register, a woman presented the police with her birth certificate and underwent a sort of background check, fielding questions like whether she was married, whether she had children, and what her parents had done for a living. Once registered, these women had to consent to a series of rules, most notably the mandatory health checks for syphilis, which are described as inspiring Nana's terrible fear of the police in Émile Zola's famous work of the same name. These compulsory medical exams, known as contrôles sanitaires, took place in a special part of the police department and required women to allow doctors to examine their sexes in an invasive manner. The doctors originally had the women sit on a table with a raised plank at one end for their feet to rest on. However, this soon turned into a sort of reclining chair, which encouraged the spreading of the woman's legs. It was in this reclining, vulnerable position that Nana felt so fearsome when she worried about the chair and the invasion of her modesty that it would cause. These checks were also performed at very high speed, adding to the sense of inhumanity they provoked. Each day during the Second Empire, about 52 women were examined per hour, with independent prostitutes required to be examined twice per month. And if you were found to have syphilis, then the real terror, as Nana saw it, began as you were sent to the prison hospital of Saint-Lazare. This hospital was much feared by the Parisian prostitutes of the Second Empire, and was described as being filthy and harsh in its treatment of the inmates. The women were kept in the hospital until they could be shown to be cured, and as a result, some women came up with systems to evade detection of their diseases. Essentially, they were desperate to escape Saint-Lazare's confines. Nana also fears Saint-Lazare, largely because of the descriptions she received from Satin, who spent time there. In Nana's words, Saint-Lazare was like a tomb, an enormous black hole in which women were buried alive. It was in this culture of regulation and fear that prostitutes like Nana operated in Paris during the Second Empire. Aside from regulation, though, they faced the added challenge of lack of methods to stop the spread of syphilis. One of the few methods was the use of condoms, but this did only a little to decrease fear of the disease. Known as English overcoats, they were made of sheep gut with a ribbon used to close the open end. However, few their methods of protection might have been, it continued to be the women themselves who bore the brunt of the blame and the corresponding punishment for the spread of syphilis in Paris's population. This only began to change in 1901 with the founding of the Société Française de Prophylaxie Sanitaire et Morale. Made up of a group of important doctors, police officers, pharmacists, and lawyers, the organization's stated goal was to truly stop the rampant spread of syphilis. They, as those before them, viewed it not only as a hygienic problem, but a social one as well. And yet, in this case, some of the blame began to shift from the prostitutes and women in general to the syphilitic and weakened men. This change did not fully alleviate the clear consequence of the public health regulations that had been put in place surrounding prostitution previously, however. The subjugation of women and scapegoating, which resulted from such blatant placement of blame, would take much more than the foundation of one organization to alleviate.